"Dance with me, beautiful." A man's voice reeked of whiskey. She didn't know he was a mafia boss. The air inside Club Nocturne was thick, not just with the scent of expensive perfume or the wine that spilled across the floorboards, but with something far heavier: ambition, exhaustion, and secrets too tightly wound to ever be spoken aloud. I adjusted the tray in my hands, balancing 4 martinis as the bass rolled through the wooden floor like a wave, crawling up the muscles in my legs, a low warning that this place was never meant for the weak. I slipped through the packed crowd, all sweat and fractured laughter and pulsing lights, eyes always downcast to avoid the trap of accidental eye contact. That was the first rule I had learned in the early weeks of working here: be invisible. 6 months had passed since I took this job, 2 shifts a day, feet gone numb from the pain, the only black shirt I owned faded from too many washes. But I had no choice. The meager money I brought home each night was the only thing keeping the lights on in my tiny apartment and the medicine going for my younger brother, Ethan. Ethan was just 25, but his body had aged beyond 50, ravaged by the cruel grip of multiple sclerosis. The disease moved quickly, stealing his strength in pieces, step by step, day by day, and I kept working, kept serving, kept smiling when there was nothing worth smiling for. A man in a suit and tie stumbled into my path, tipping one of the martinis and sending the cold liquid spilling across the back of my hand, trailing down into my sleeve. I said nothing but a soft apology, even though it wasn't my fault. In this place, blame didn't matter. My gaze stayed locked on the velvet rope stretched tight across the floor, dividing the main floor from the elevated VIP area above. That space was always guarded by 2 broad-shouldered men in black suits, earpieces tucked into their ears, faces carved from stone and permanently untouched by smiles. Vanessa, the hostess who had trained me in my first few days, had been very clear: never look a VIP guest in the eyes. They don't want to see you unless they call you, especially not on Thursday nights. Thursdays, the night when the man behind Club Nocturne might appear. I had seen him only twice, or rather, seen the shape of him, a tall silhouette, always flanked by other suited men, with knotted cravats and women glittering like they had been brushed with gold. Everyone leaned toward him, like flowers bending toward the sun. My friend Monica called him Nick the Beautiful, but only in whispers, only when she was sure no manager was within earshot. They said that by the age of 38, he controlled half the nightlife scene in Chicago. They said people who crossed him simply disappeared. They said his connections were so deep that even the police stayed away. I didn't want to know more. I only needed this job to pay rent and keep Ethan's prescriptions going. One of the guards nodded slightly as I approached, and silently unhooked the velvet rope. No words, only actions. I stepped into the VIP area, careful as I set each martini down on the gleaming glass table. My voice was low, and even when I said, 4 martinis, then I turned to leave before anyone could complain about the drink that had been spilled earlier. A word stopped me, small but heavy with power. Wait. I froze. Just one word, smooth and commanding. I didn't dare turn fully, only lifted my chin a little. And I saw him, for the first time, truly saw him, and in that moment, everything began to change. If you're still listening, then perhaps the story of Grace and Nick Romano has already wrapped itself around you, holding your attention in a way that's hard to let go. Before we step into the next chapter, full of unexpected turns, take a moment to subscribe to the Dear Single Mom YouTube channel. Hit the like button on this video and share it with someone you believe could use a little feeling, a little hope, and maybe even a little spark of something they haven't felt in a long time. We tell these stories not just to entertain, but to reach the quiet corners of the heart that often go untouched. Where are you listening from? Is it a quiet spot in your living room, a stretch of road as you drive home, or maybe somewhere in the city that knows your name? Leave a comment and let us know where this story has found you, so we can see just how far this emotional journey has traveled. Thank you for being here. And now, let's continue with part 2 of the story, where everything begins to change forever. I didn't dare turn all the way around. I only lifted my head slightly, and that was when I saw him. For the first time, truly saw him. That table had 4 people. 3 women dressed in the kind of luxury that made others instinctively step aside, and 1 man. They were all striking, sculpted like they had stepped out of a high-end fashion campaign. But the man was something else entirely. He wasn't just handsome. He was the center. Every bit of light in the room seemed to bend toward him. Black hair, swept back to reveal a face cut in sharp relief. High cheekbones, a square jaw, eyes the color of dark earth where light went in and never came out. His charcoal gray suit fit like it had been sewn onto him, the top buttons casually undone, exposing bronzed skin and the edge of a tattoo that disappeared beneath his sternum. One hand was still lifted, a finger pointed lazily in my direction, commanding even without his eyes meeting mine. He was still looking at his phone. I froze, every muscle drawn tight. One of the women turned, lifting her newly delivered martini, and her face twisted with disapproval. She raised the glass with crimson nails that shimmered under the lights. "This isn't right," she said, her voice lazy but loud enough to reach me. "I ordered a dirty martini. This one isn't dirty." I swallowed hard, keeping my tone calm. "I'm sorry. I'll replace it for you right away." No one looked at me, except him. The man with the dark eyes finally glanced up from his phone, and when his gaze met mine, it cut through me like a blade. His eyes moved from my face to my mouth, then down to the wine stain still wet on my sleeve. There was something in his eyes then. A flicker. I couldn't tell if it was annoyance or curiosity. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, touched with an Italian cadence overlaid by something American, like a melody you can't quite predict. "Grace," I answered, and instantly regretted saying it aloud. He repeated it, tasting the name slowly. "Grace Donovan." I couldn't remember telling him my last name, but when he spoke it, something in my chest dropped. "Bring her the correct dirty martini," he said, his gaze still holding mine before shifting to the woman who had complained. "Then come back." I nodded quickly and turned away as fast as I could, nearly colliding with another server on my rush to escape the VIP floor. In the staff break room, my hands were still trembling as I peeled off my damp shirt. I dug through my locker, found a clean one, though it clung uncomfortably tight across the chest. I had no other option. As I was fixing my hair in the mirror, Monica walked in, lipstick tube in hand. "Good God, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, tilting her head to catch my reflection. I tried to sound casual. "It's nothing, just bumped into a VIP." Her eyes widened. "Was it him? Nick Romano?" I nodded. Monica grabbed my arm, her voice dropping to a whisper but sharpening like a knife. "Grace, listen to me. If it was him, you need to be careful. Very careful. Nick Romano isn't just some VIP. He's the boss. The kind of man the police don't even want to deal with." I forced a small laugh, swallowing the lump in my throat. "It's just a drink. I'll bring it, and then I'm back to the main floor." But Monica didn't look convinced, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed myself either. Outside in the hallway, our manager's voice called out my name like usual. "Donovan, break's over. VIP's waiting on that dirty martini. Move it." I tugged the hem of my shirt, took a deep breath, and stepped back out. The martini this time was perfect. I returned to the table. He was speaking to an older man now, whose face carried the kind of weight that suggested even more power than Romano himself. No one noticed me. I placed the drink on the table. No one looked up. I turned to leave. And then, like something out of a scene spliced into a film, everything shifted. A hand grabbed my wrist as I gathered empty glasses. "Dance with me, beautiful," a voice slurred, thick with the stench of whiskey. I pulled my arm back. "I'm working, sir. Please let go." But he didn't. Instead, his grip tightened. "Just one dance. Don't be so difficult." I turned, searching the crowd for a guard, but no one was looking. The music pounded, lights flashing in dizzy bursts. "I'm a server, and you're hurting me. Even better," he whispered, yanking me closer. "I like a woman who puts up a fight." I struggled, my hands shaking with fury, and then I backed into someone behind me. A drink slipped from their hand and shattered on the floor. I turned, ready to apologize, but the words caught in my throat. Nick Romano stood there, his gaze colder than steel. Behind him, his 2 bodyguards stood tense and silent. "What's going on here?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it squeezed the air from the room. The man laughed nervously. "Nothing, buddy. Just asking her to dance." Nick glanced down at the hand still wrapped around my wrist. "She's working," he said, and she said no. "I don't want any trouble," the man muttered, letting go, stepping back. Didn't know she was with someone. Nick's jaw tightened. Then he turned to me, his gaze cutting through every defense I had. "Dance with me," he said. I froze, but before I could answer, he leaned in, voice close to my ear. "Dance with me. Let him know you're not alone." And so, beneath the pounding electronic music, in a sea of pulsing light and hundreds of half-drunk strangers, Nick Romano and I began to dance, slowly, as if the world around us had stopped moving. And in that moment, I knew this was no longer just a job. This was the moment my life turned in a direction I could never undo. Nick Romano and I moved through the chaos of the crowd like two people stepping into another world, a world where sound receded into the background and his gaze held me in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the electronic beat pounding through the club. His hand rested firmly on the small of my back, steady and warm through the thin fabric of my shirt. The other hand held mine lightly, guiding each step with a control that was gentle but absolute. I couldn't explain why my feet kept moving when my mind had gone completely blank. I should have said no. I should have gone back to work. But instead, I let myself be led. His eyes were so close I could see the faint gold flecks buried in their deep brown darkness. That gaze wasn't demanding, wasn't exaggerated, it was calm, terrifyingly so. "Your shift ended 10 minutes ago," he said, his voice pulled from somewhere deep within his chest, rich and low. "Marco has already informed the manager." I tried to keep my voice level. "I don't remember being told I could clock out early." "You don't need to remember. I made that decision for you." There was something so composed, so unapologetic in the way he said it, that it left me speechless. I should have felt offended. But instead, I felt something far more dangerous than anger. I felt noticed. I felt seen. And for a moment, that felt like warmth. "Why would you do that?" I asked, unable to hide my suspicion. He looked at me as if the question itself amused him. "Maybe because I don't like watching my employees get hassled. Or maybe because you look tired, and someone should help you, at least once." I wanted to say I was fine, that I could take care of myself. But the way he said it, the way he looked at me, broke every protest before it reached my lips. The dance ended and I had no memory of how we'd moved. When the music shifted into a new rhythm, faster, more alive, he let go of my hand slowly, deliberately, his eyes still on mine. "Thank you for the dance, Grace Donovan." I looked up. "How do you know my last name?" A faint smile crossed his lips. "I know everyone who works for me." Before I could respond, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small white card. There was nothing on it except a phone number, printed in deep black ink. He placed it in my palm. "If anyone bothers you again, here or anywhere else, call this number. Anytime." I held the card, still unsure how to react, but he was already walking away. No theatrics, no show, just him, vanishing into the crowd with two suited men following like shadows. I stood there for a while, the card cold in my hand, before hurrying back to the staff room. Monica was taking off her shoes, catching my reflection in the mirror. "You just danced with Nick Romano." I didn't answer. I opened my locker, pulled off the tight uniform shirt, and changed into my street clothes. "And he gave you his card?" she asked. This time with disbelief she didn't bother to hide. "I'm not sure. Maybe it's just, in case something like earlier happens again." She stayed quiet for a few seconds, then sighed. "Grace, I don't know if you should feel lucky or terrified. A man like him noticing you is never simple." I slipped on my shoes, tucking the card into the pocket of my coat. A soft knock at the door made us both turn. A man in his early 30s stood there, hair cut short, dressed in a tailored suit. He spoke with formal politeness. "Grace Donovan?" I nodded. "I'm Paulo. Mr. Romano has arranged for a car to take you home." I froze. Monica's eyes widened. I turned to her, searching for a suggestion. Anything. But she only gave a small nod, her eyes filled with quiet caution. Paulo led me through the back hallway reserved for staff. A black car waited just outside the club, gleaming beneath the golden light cast from the brick walls. As the car pulled away, I stared out the window. Tonight, the wind felt colder than usual. But I wasn't cold. Something inside me had awakened, and I didn't know if it was excitement or fear. Maybe it was both. The next morning, as the pale winter sunlight slipped through the thin curtain, I had already been awake for some time, lying still on the bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. My mind spun with the images from the night before, the music, the lights, the drunken customer, his hand on the small of my back during that slow dance. Nick Romano. That name echoed in my head like a repeating note I couldn't shake loose. I reached toward the coat hanging from the hook beside the bed. The white business card was still there, smooth and cold, as if it held within it an unspoken promise I didn't yet understand. I had never met anyone like him. Everyone said he was dangerous, powerful. But there was something strange in his eyes last night. It wasn't possession. It wasn't control. It was a quieter kind of attention, something deeper, and it made me want to step closer even as my instincts begged me to run. I was lost in thought when my phone buzzed. A message. The number was unfamiliar, but I knew exactly who it was. "Did you get home safely?" I sat upright, my hand gripping the phone tight. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend that last night had been nothing but a vivid dream. But another part of me knew I was standing at the edge of something far larger than the life I'd always known. A few minutes later I replied, "Yes, I'm home. Thank you for the ride." The response came almost instantly. "Good. Today is Ethan's hospital appointment, isn't it?" My body went still. I had never mentioned Ethan to anyone at the club. Not the manager, not Monica. I had always kept my family separate from work, and yet, Nick Romano knew. I stared at the message like it was written in code. How could he know? My fingers moved slowly as I typed, hands shaking. "How do you know about my brother?" The dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. "Finally," he replied, "I make it a point to know the people who work for me, and the ones I care about." The air in the room seemed to thin by half. Before I could respond, another message arrived. "The weather is rough today, cold wind. I've arranged a car to take both of you at 2 o'clock. The driver's name is Paolo. He'll wait as long as needed." I tightened my grip on the phone, my thoughts tangled. He hadn't asked if I wanted the help. He hadn't waited for my permission. He simply informed me. A gesture of care wrapped in the fabric of control. I should have felt alarmed, should have felt that my boundaries were being crossed. But instead, what I felt was something like relief. Every hospital trip with Ethan was a trial. 3 buses, over an hour in transit, and every time, he came back spent, his ankles swollen, his back aching. I left the room and stepped lightly into the kitchen. Ethan sat there, leaning back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly as he held a cup of tea. He turned and gave me a faint smile. "You're up early. Another sleepless night?" I nodded, poured myself some coffee, and sat across from him. "Ethan, someone's giving us a ride to the hospital today." He raised his eyebrows. "Who?" I looked into my coffee, my voice soft. "The owner of the club. His name is Nick Romano." Ethan stayed quiet for a few seconds. "How does he know about me?" I had no answer. I could only look at my brother, thin and pale, trying his best to appear unfazed. "It's fine. If someone's driving us, that's a good thing. Saves us from dragging through the bus lines again." But his eyes said something else. A quiet wariness, as if Ethan had always known that anything which came too easily often came with a price. I held my phone again, rereading the messages, every word. I didn't know what Nick Romano truly wanted, but it was clear that he had already stepped into my life, and he didn't seem to have any plans to leave. The black car pulled up to the entrance of Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 10 minutes to 3. Ethan sat quietly in the back seat, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the window as though trying to memorize each row of trees shedding the last of their autumn leaves. Paolo opened the door for us. I helped my brother out, sliding my arm around his shoulders to steady him. A cold wind swept through the white stone corridor leading into the hospital, making me shiver, but Ethan only gave a faint smile. "At least we didn't have to crawl through 3 bus transfers today," he said softly, his voice weak but laced with dry humor. I smiled back, thin and tight, saying nothing. In my mind, Nick Romano's final message from this morning still echoed. "I'll take care of the rest." That line hung between promise and warning. I hadn't had the chance to ask what exactly he meant by the rest before the car arrived. And now here I was, standing in the sterile lobby of the hospital, where the fluorescent lighting made everything feel both too cold and too real. We waited for about 15 minutes before a nurse called Ethan's name. I moved to stand with him, but before I could take a step, a voice came from behind me. "Grace." I turned. It was him, Nick Romano. There were no bodyguards flanking him, no aura of glamour, no flashing lights. Just a man in a dark wool coat with the collar turned up, black leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. But it was still him, unmistakable. That face, that gaze, and the way space itself seemed to recede as he moved closer. I straightened. "What are you doing here?" I didn't try to hide the edge in my voice. Nick glanced at Ethan, then back at me. "I just wanted to make sure your brother was all right." Ethan gave a soft cough, then nodded politely. "Hello, sir. Call me Nick," he said, then turned to me again. "Can we speak privately for a moment?" I glanced around, then led him down a quiet corridor with tall windows casting pale light across the tiled floor. I folded my arms, trying to keep my voice steady. "You know too much about me, about my family, and now you're here. What is it that you really want?" Nick looked at me for a long moment before answering. "I want to help." "Why?" I asked, my voice hardening. "I'm not important. I'm just a cocktail waitress. And you're—" He finished the sentence for me. "Someone with too much power and no real reason to care about you, right?" I didn't respond. He exhaled, the sound no more than a whisper. Grace, I'm not doing this out of pity, and I'm not doing it because I feel obligated. I'm doing it because I want to. Want what? I asked, my words sharp. Nick met my eyes. I want Ethan to get proper treatment. I want you to wake up in the morning without worrying about the electric bill or rent or which medication you can afford this week. I want you to have space to breathe. I laughed, but there was no joy in it. Space to breathe? You think that's all I need? That I'll be grateful and fall into your arms? If that's the plan, then... He cut me off, his voice calm but firm. Grace, I've done bad things in my life. Plenty of them, but this is not one of them. I'm not offering this in exchange for anything. I don't want you to feel indebted. This isn't a debt. It's an offer. I went quiet. The wind funneled through the hallway, cutting through the layers of my coat. He continued. I've spoken to Ethan's doctor. I want to sponsor 6 months of specialized treatment. Fully covered. Quietly. No one will know. No strings. No conditions. I looked at him, searching his face for any hint of deceit. But all I found was darkness vast and unreadable. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I could believe him, but I knew one thing. I couldn't say no. Not because I was weak, but because of Ethan. Because my brother needed this. And if it meant accepting help from someone like Nick Romano, then I would. But I wouldn't forget that everything in this world comes with a price, and sooner or later, I would have to find out what exactly he was trying to buy. The call came 2 days later, from an unfamiliar number. On the other end was Paulo's voice, calm and formal as always. He said only what was necessary. Nick was inviting me to dinner at his private home. Not a party, no other guests, just him and me. I nearly declined. I almost invented an excuse, something believable to keep my distance. But the promise of medical support for Ethan still hung in the air like a silent hook pulling me forward. And beneath that, something else had begun to stir inside me, curiosity. I wanted to know who this man truly was, and why someone like him would care about someone like me. The car arrived at 6 in the evening, pulling me out of the city and into the quiet suburbs where tree-lined roads curved gently through the dark. We passed under the shadows of tall branches, arriving at a gated property set back from the street, surrounded by a sleek black iron fence. The Romano estate rose in warm light behind it, grand without boasting, silent and tightly composed. No guards at the gate, no line of expensive cars. But I didn't doubt for a second that the place was more secure than any 5-star hotel I had ever heard of. Paulo opened the door and guided me through the front entrance before vanishing without a sound. I stood in the wide foyer, its chandelier casting soft gold across polished wood floors. Abstract paintings lined the hallway walls. The air smelled faintly of oak, red wine, and something else I couldn't name but felt achingly familiar, as if the house itself carried memories. I felt like I had stepped out of time. Nick appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark trousers, no jacket, no tie. Casual, but not careless. Everything about him was deliberate. He led me to the dining room, where a table for 2 had been set under the glow of candlelight, the glasses clear, the silver perfectly aligned. No servers, no small talk from across the room, just the quiet rustle of jazz floating from somewhere nearby. "Thank you for coming," he said, pulling out my chair. I sat down, trying to still the slight tremor in my hands. "I don't really know what to say in situations like this," I admitted. "Situations like what?" he asked, his tone light, as if we were talking about the weather. "Like when an ordinary woman is invited to the private home of the most powerful man in the city for a private dinner." He smiled without denying it. "Maybe you're not as ordinary as you think. And maybe you're not as simple as you pretend to be," I said, watching him carefully. Dinner was served by a young chef who appeared for only seconds before disappearing again. The main course was roasted lamb with herbed potatoes and a sauce so subtle I barely noticed it on my tongue. I couldn't taste anything. Every question Nick asked felt gentle, but his words were precise. He asked about my childhood, my mother, the years after my father left. I answered as little as I could, keeping my tone even. But then came the question that stopped me. "Do you believe in design, Grace?" I looked up at him. "Are you talking about fate?" He shook his head slowly. "Not exactly. I'm talking about things that happen at the right moment, with the right person, even if no one planned it. Like me crossing paths with you." I let out a quiet laugh, but it felt colder than I meant. "Some things don't happen because of fate. They happen because someone made sure they would. Both can be true," he said, lifting his glass, his eyes watching me over the rim. "But what matters is what you do once you've stepped into the game." I didn't know how to answer, but I knew one thing. I'd taken my seat at the table, and more clearly than ever, I could feel that this wasn't just dinner. This was an invitation into a world I'd never imagined, one I wouldn't be able to leave behind. After the meal, I expected him to walk me to the door, maybe offer coffee as a polite end to a conversation that had already run deep, but instead, Nick stood and motioned for me to follow. He said nothing, and I trailed after him through the wood-paneled hallway, the golden wall sconces casting long shadows behind us like echoes of the choice I'd just made. He opened a door into a small room. Nothing flashy. A tidy desk, dark wood shelves lined with books, a worn leather chair, and across from it, a large window overlooking the backyard, where tall pine trees stood still beneath the night sky. Nick stepped behind the desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a thick envelope. He placed it gently in front of me. Inside were photographs. Before I could ask, he spoke. I wasn't sure whether to show you this earlier or wait, but after tonight, I think you deserve to know. I sat down slowly, my hand trembling slightly as I lifted the first photograph. A man stood on a train platform, wearing a gray coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. But his eyes, those eyes, I recognized them almost instantly. 14 years had passed, and time had carved its marks into that face, deepening the lines, hollowing the cheeks. But I still knew him. My father, Richard Donovan. My breath caught in my throat. My heart pounded so loudly it echoed in my ears. The next photo showed him crossing a street in Boston, then sitting alone at a cafe near the Canadian border. One, blurred and grainy, captured him as he stepped into a small hotel in Seattle, his head down, his shoulders hunched. All the images were taken from a distance, slightly out of focus. But I didn't need clarity to know the truth. It was him. I looked up at Nick, my voice barely more than a whisper. Why do you have these? Nick leaned against the desk, his eyes steady on mine. Because I had someone follow him. For the past 2 years, I tightened my grip on the photos, the paper stiff and cold in my hands. I thought he was dead. My mother, she believed he left us, that he walked away and never came back. Nick nodded slowly. He did leave, but not entirely by choice. I stared at him, waiting. And then, as if he had rehearsed every word, he began to speak. Carefully, slowly. Your father used to work for the government, for a long time, but then he got caught up in something known as Callaway. It was an off-the-record operation, involving the transfer of highly sensitive data between corporations and political interests. Very few people survived knowing the full extent of it. Richard Donovan was one of the few who got out. I felt the blood drain from my body. So he's a criminal? Nick shook his head. Not exactly, but he's being hunted. By more than one side. And if they find you or Ethan, you could be used as bait. I didn't even realize I was standing until I heard the creak of the floor beneath me. I took a step back, the photographs clutched in my hand. Why now? Why are you telling me this? Why is it you? Why not the police? Or anyone else? Nick stepped closer, his voice low and quiet. Because the police may already know, but they won't step in. This isn't something handled in the open. And because I'm the only one with a reason not to let Richard die. At least, not yet. I narrowed my eyes. What's your connection to him? There was a pause, a long, deliberate silence before he spoke again. I had a brother. He died because of Callaway. Richard is the last link still alive. The weight of those words hit me hard. I sat down again, dizzy. Everything I'd ever believed about my father, his disappearance, the silence, the long, aching absence that shaped my entire life. It wasn't neglect. It wasn't abandonment. He was running. And Nick Romano, the man I barely knew, the man who was slowly stepping into the center of my life, held the key to the deepest secret I'd ever faced. Do you want to see him? Nick asked, his voice softer now. I looked up at him, caught between grief, fury, and a flicker of hope so fragile it barely breathed. I didn't know what my answer was, but I knew one thing. From this moment on, everything had changed, and there was no going back to the life I had before. I don't remember exactly how I left Nick Romano's house. Everything after seeing my father's face in those photographs became a blur. Fragments of wind brushing against the car windows, the faint scent of leather from the seats, and the chaotic rhythm of my heartbeat echoing in my chest. By the time I reached the apartment, the city was deep into the night. Streetlights poured their soft yellow glow into the living room, casting long quiet streaks across the peeling walls, like witnesses to every fracture that had just surfaced. Ethan was still awake, sitting on the couch, a blanket wrapped around his legs, an open book resting unread in his lap. He looked up as I entered, his eyes filled with concern. You were gone longer than usual, he said softly, his voice already fraying at the edges. I didn't answer right away. I just sat beside him and stared down at my own hands, which were trembling with something I hadn't yet named. After a long moment, I finally spoke. "Do you remember what Dad looked like?" Ethan paused, his brow furrowing. "Just vaguely. Last time I saw him, I was 7. Why?" I handed him the stack of photographs Nick had given me. Ethan took them with curiosity first, then surprise, and finally a stunned stillness that settled over his face like a heavy fog. "It's him," he whispered. "That's him. Did you find him?" I nodded slowly, carefully, like the truth might collapse if I moved too quickly. "I didn't find him. Nick Romano did. He had him followed. And he's alive." Ethan said nothing at first. He laid the photos on the table, his fingers still resting on the edge of the top one as if to anchor himself. "Why didn't he come back?" I didn't know how to answer. I told him everything Nick had shared. About the Calloway project. About the danger. About how our father had disappeared for 14 years, not because he didn't care, but because he was running for his life, maybe for ours. Ethan didn't interrupt. He listened with his head slightly bowed, his hands clenched, his shoulders rigid. But when I finished, he turned to me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't shock. It was pain and betrayal. So all these years, he was alive. He knew he had 2 kids. He knew Mom died waiting for him. And he didn't come back. Not a word, not a letter, nothing. His voice shook, not with weakness, but with the pressure of too many feelings long held back. "Maybe he thought he was protecting us," I said gently. "Protecting us?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Did you feel protected when you worked double shifts to keep the lights on? When I had to skip doses because we couldn't afford the full prescription? You think he was going to show up the moment we needed him most?" I had no answer, because he was right. All these years, I had told myself stories. Maybe he died. Maybe he'd been arrested. Maybe something terrible had taken him from us. Anything was easier than believing he had chosen not to come back. But now I knew. He had chosen. And that choice had shaped everything we'd become. Ethan turned his face away, his breath uneven. If he's alive and knows everything, then he must have known I was sick too. So why now? Why show up now? Or is it not even him showing up, it's Nick Romano dragging him into the light? I sighed. I don't know. I don't know if Nick is really trying to help us or if there's something else he wants. But whatever it is, I think it's time we face it. All of it. Ethan went quiet again. We sat there in silence. The only sound the steady tick of the wall clock, reminding us that time kept moving, whether or not we were ready to follow. I didn't know if I could forgive my father. I didn't know if Ethan ever would. But one thing was certain. This secret had broken open, and there was no going back to the life we lived before. Whatever path lay ahead, whatever truth, whatever damage it would begin tonight, with this revelation, and all the wounds it brought with it. The next morning, I woke to the soft gray light slipping through the window, and an uneasy stillness that hung in the air like a thin veil of fog. Ethan was still asleep on the couch, his face drawn with exhaustion after a night weighed down by everything that had surfaced. I made coffee without drinking it, my eyes fixed on my phone. No new messages, no missed calls. Just silence, the kind of silence that doesn't soothe, but warns. At almost 8, a message appeared. A number I knew by heart by now. "We need to talk. Urgently." It was from Nick. Moments later, my phone rang. I answered, heart racing. His voice came through steady, but lower than usual. "Grace, someone was watching your apartment last night." I froze. "What do you mean? Watching?" Nick didn't let the panic settle in for long. "My people spotted a vehicle parked 2 blocks away from your building. It stayed there from midnight until near dawn. Cameras caught a man wearing a cap and a mask circling the area. He's not one of mine. And he's not just curious." I dropped into the chair behind me, my mind suddenly blank. "You think they're looking for my father?" "I think they're looking for you. Or for Ethan. And if they've made the connection between you and Richard Donovan, then you are not safe there, not for one more second." I looked over at Ethan, who was beginning to stir. A wave of dread swept over me, slow and cold. It wasn't like a threat. It was like standing in front of a closed door, knowing something waited behind it, silent and patient. "You need to leave now," Nick said firmly. "My people are on their way. Paula will pick you both up in 30 minutes. I've prepared another apartment, fully secure, top-grade surveillance and medical systems in place." "How long have you been planning this?" I asked, my throat tightening. "Since the night you agreed to come to the estate. I always prepare for a second option." For the first time, I felt the weight of how deeply I was being pulled into something far beyond my own world. This was no longer just about late shifts. hospital visits, or keeping Ethan's medication going. This was a network of secrets, silent threats, and men like Nick Romano, men who were always one step ahead and never told you everything. I woke Ethan, told him what happened while he packed what little we had. He didn't ask many questions. He just nodded and began gathering what was essential, like someone already used to leaving without goodbyes. "You okay?" I asked as he sat to tie his shoes. "No," he said quietly, looking up at me, "but I'm not surprised. I guess it's time we stop trying to outrun the past, even when it keeps chasing us." Paulo arrived exactly on time. The black SUV slipped down the quiet streets like a shadow gliding through the pale morning. As we turned onto a narrow street on the city's western edge, I realized I didn't recognize the area at all. The new apartment was inside a luxury building, guarded around the clock, biometric entry, cameras at every angle. It was clean, modern, expansive. Wide windows overlooked the river. Ethan had a separate room, outfitted with medical equipment far more advanced than anything I'd ever seen in a hospital waiting room. Everything had been prepared ahead of time, perfectly, thoughtfully, almost too much so. When the door closed behind us, I stood still in the center of the living room. It felt like stepping into another life, one that didn't belong to me. No one had said we were prisoners, but I knew the truth. There were soft beds, hot meals, security systems, but freedom here was measured by someone else's terms, and that someone was Nick Romano. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. "How long do you think we'll be here?" I shook my head, my eyes fixed on the surveillance screen showing the hallway outside. "As long as our father is alive, and as long as someone out there still wants to find him, we're not leaving." I didn't know when any of this would end, but I did know that from the moment someone started watching us, we were no longer on the outside. We were in it now, deep inside the storm. 3 days passed inside that pristine, high-rise apartment like a somber dream with no way out. Everything around us was perfect to an almost unnatural degree. Each morning, a basket of fresh fruit waited outside the door. Ethan received visits twice a day from a private physician who brought new medications, even a therapeutic machine I'd only ever seen in hospital wings. A silent security team monitored the building around the clock, their presence discreet but unmistakably alert to every movement. I knew these comforts didn't come without a price, and whatever that price was, it hadn't yet been named, but it existed, waiting for the right moment to be called into the light. I couldn't stand the silence anymore. On the third night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, I stood at the living room window, phone in hand, my finger hovering over the number I knew by heart. I had waited long enough. My message was short, just 3 words. "I need to meet." 10 minutes later, a knock. Paulo stood at the door, as calm as ever. "Mr. Romano is expecting you downstairs. The car is ready." I nodded, grabbed my coat, and followed him. The city outside was still and cold, the streets of Chicago emptied under a velvet sky. Time felt slower than usual, as if every second wanted me to reconsider. But the car kept moving, and eventually, we stopped at an abandoned dock. Nick stood there alone, a long coat wrapped around him, collar turned up against the wind, the yellow glow of a street lamp catching the ripples of dark water behind him. His shadow stretched across the concrete like a question unanswered. I walked toward him without speaking. He turned and met my eyes, then spoke first. "I assume you have questions." "Not one," I said, more steadily than I felt. "Many." He said nothing. I took a breath. My voice came out low, but sharp. "Why are you helping us? Really? Is it because my father knew your brother? Is it Ethan's illness? Or is it just because you can?" He didn't respond right away. He looked at me, and his eyes were dark, quiet, deep, unreadable. "I'm helping because I care." I laughed, bitterly. "Care? You didn't even know we existed 2 months ago." "I knew enough," he said, his voice measured. "Enough to see you gave up your youth for your brother. Enough to know you don't trust anyone, not even yourself. And enough to see that without me, you wouldn't last much longer. That's pity, not care." "No," he said calmly. "That's the truth." I turned my face away, fists clenched. The wind off the lake slapped cold across my skin, sobering my thoughts. "What do you want from me?" I finally asked the question that had haunted me since the night he first stepped into my life. Nick took a step forward, but left just enough space not to touch. "I want you to live, not just survive, to live with hope, with freedom, without waking up in fear every morning." I met his eyes, steady and unwavering. "You speak as if you don't want anything, but no one helps for nothing, not even you." He nodded slowly. "I want you to trust me. That's all. To believe that I won't hurt you. That not everyone in my world is cold or cruel. He stepped back, restoring the distance. But I won't force it. I can protect you. But I can't make you believe in me. Silence pressed between us, thick as fog. I looked down at his shadow stretched across the concrete like an old scar. I didn't know if I could trust him, but I knew, among all the things I couldn't control, he was the only one who had chosen to stand beside me, and maybe that meant something. When he opened the car door for me, neither of us spoke. But as I looked back through the window, he was still standing there, watching, unmoving, like a promise unspoken, waiting to be kept. And for the first time, the doubt I carried wasn't just pushing against him, it was pushing against my own hope that maybe, just maybe, he meant what he said. The next morning, I woke to a mind still tangled from the night before. Not because Nick had said anything grand or manipulative, but because of the quiet certainty in his words. I couldn't tell what was real and what was part of the game. In the kitchen, I made coffee and stared out from the 23rd floor. The river below curled like a silver ribbon between the buildings. The apartment was as silent as ever, but something inside me had shifted. Something was coming, and this time, it wasn't fear. The phone rang, cutting through the quiet like a blade. I jumped, the screen glowing with an unfamiliar number. No name, just numbers. My heart skipped once, then started pounding. I answered, my voice caught somewhere between fear and something else I couldn't name. Grace. The voice was low, rough around the edges. Not unfamiliar. Not anymore. There was a pause, as if my name had been lodged in his throat for years. It's your father. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I know, he continued, voice tightening. I know it's not easy to forgive, and I know I have no right to ask. But if you're willing, just once, come see me. I didn't know when the tears had started. They weren't loud or dramatic. They simply arrived, quietly slipping down my face as if each word had cut something loose inside me. Why now? I asked, my voice shaking. Why not 10 years ago? Or 5, when Mom was still alive? There was silence. Then softly, because I thought keeping my distance was the only way to protect you. And maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was a coward. But now, if I don't say this, I might never get another chance. He gave me the location. A glass house in the Northern Botanical Gardens. End of the week. Private. Safe. Few people knew. He asked that I come alone. When I ended the call, my hand was still trembling. Ethan looked up from the couch, book in hand, his expression sharpening when he saw my face. What is it? I sat beside him, struggling to keep my voice calm. It was Dad, he just called. Ethan froze. His eyes blinked rapidly, like his brain needed a few moments to process the words. What did he say? He wants to meet. Just me. At the botanical garden. Ethan placed the book down slowly, the weight of the moment settling between us. Then he said, without hesitation, I'm coming with you. He asked for me alone, I said. He said the fewer people, the safer. Safer? Ethan scoffed. That's exactly why I have to come. You can't go alone, Grace. Not after everything. You've been healing, I said gently. It's been a long road. I don't want you risking everything for a conversation that might only bring more pain. He shook his head. Do you really think we'll heal without answers? Do you think I can go on living with 100 questions in my head about the man who left us for half our lives? I didn't respond. Because I knew he was right. Some wounds don't scar over until they've been cut open again. No matter how strong we were, how much we had endured, we couldn't keep pretending we didn't need the truth. That night, I messaged Nick. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't explain. I simply told him. We're going to meet him. Both of us. His response came an hour later. Brief. I'll make sure you're safe. But don't believe anything he says unless you have proof. I stared at the words, then placed the phone down. None of us were naive anymore. No one believed in truth just because it sounded tender over a phone line. But somewhere deep inside, in a place I tried to keep quiet, there was still a small voice, one that wanted to believe that within all the lies, there might still be something real. And if there was, I needed to hear it. With my own ears. We both did. Not just to forgive, but to move forward, and finally stop looking back. In the 3 days leading up to the meeting, the apartment seemed suspended in a strange kind of stillness. No words were spoken about it, but both Ethan and I could feel time moving steadily toward a moment neither of us was truly prepared to face. And yet, the meeting inevitable as gravity was coming. Each morning, Nick's doctor arrived, carrying sleek medical devices and a fresh bag of medication. He was a man of few words, precise in his manner, almost too careful in his silences. He was so thorough, so impeccably professional, that I sometimes wondered if all of this was necessary, or if it was just another expression of Nick's brand of control, dressed up in courtesy and care. Ethan was getting stronger. Or more accurately, he was determined to appear stronger. He moved more each day, sat longer, and didn't flinch anymore when I mentioned our father. In fact, it was Ethan now who asked the questions quietly, sometimes at breakfast, sometimes just before bed. What did he used to like? Did he ever take you to the park? Did he really lock the keys in the car once like Mom always said? I tried to remember, but the truth was, I didn't have much. The memories I had of my father were broken and scattered fragments more than stories. A scent of cologne lingering on a coat, the way it felt to ride on his shoulders over the little bridge behind our house, the warmth of his hand around mine, and then, the sharp, unmistakable feeling of being left behind. That sensation was the clearest memory of all. So sharp, so lasting, it had eclipsed everything else. It had defined the space he left in my life. And yet now, as the day drew closer, we were both beginning to realize maybe knowing why mattered more than we had allowed ourselves to admit. On Friday evening, Nick arrived without warning. He stood at the door alone, no entourage, no armored presence. When I opened it, he said only one thing. "Are you ready?" I stepped aside to let him in. For the first time, he didn't pause to scan the space, didn't check the corners like a man used to being hunted. He walked straight to the sofa and sat down as if this place had long since become part of his world. "Tomorrow won't be easy," he said, placing a small wooden box on the table in front of us. "I thought you might want to bring something that reminds him who you are." I opened the lid. Inside were a few old items, worn and quiet with time. A faded postcard from Florence, a rough charcoal sketch of a red-roofed house nestled between rolling hills, a small piece of paper with delicate handwriting, a line in Italian. I looked up, stunned. These belong to my father. He sent them?" Nick nodded. "I found them in an old archive, once kept by someone who worked with him. In the early years, after he disappeared, he tried to send letters home, but no one dared to pass them on. Every connection was cut." I touched the edge of the postcard. I remembered Florence only as a name I'd seen in photos once, never knowing why it mattered. Florence was the city he dreamed of taking the whole family to, Nick said, reading my silence. A plan that never happened. A dream that was left behind. I didn't speak. I just ran my fingers along the worn border of the picture, like brushing the edges of a memory I never truly held. Ethan sat beside me, his eyes lit up with something between wonder and disbelief. He picked up the sketch and stared at it for a long time. "He drew this for you?" I asked. "For both of you," Nick replied. "It was the house he imagined, nothing grand. But he believed if the three of you could live there, the world might feel a little more at peace." I let out a laugh, sharp and hollow. "And yet he left, without a word." "He left so you could live," Nick said gently. "I'm not excusing him, but sometimes, in the world we live in, surviving is the cruelest way to love someone." I looked at him. "And you? Why are you helping me prepare to face the man who abandoned me?" Nick didn't look away, but he didn't answer immediately either. "Because I believe if you don't close that door yourself, you'll never be able to walk through the next one. And I don't want to see you stuck there." The silence between us was heavy, but not empty. I didn't know if I could believe everything he said, but there was something in his voice, quiet, steady, that made me want to listen a little longer. Before he left, Nick turned back and rested his hand lightly on the wooden box. "Take these with you. Sometimes memory doesn't save us, but it reminds us what was once real." After he was gone, Ethan and I sat together for a long time. We didn't speak much. We just looked at the pieces left behind by a man who had once been the center of our world, and then vanished as if he'd never existed at all. But now, with these small objects in front of us, the past felt closer than ever, and we knew tomorrow wasn't just a meeting. It was a journey backward, into memory, to face him, to speak the words we hadn't said for more than a decade, and maybe, just maybe, to forgive, or at the very least, to understand. That morning, the sky hung low and gray, like a thin curtain that hadn't yet been drawn back. A dim light settled over the sprawling botanical gardens on the northern edge of the city, soft and muted, as though even the sun knew not to disturb what was about to unfold. The air was still, touched only by the sound of wind, brushing through brittle lavender stalks and leaves, whispering against one another like echoes of memories, long buried, but suddenly stirring awake. Ethan and I arrived 15 minutes early. We sat on a stone bench set along a path of weathered flagstones, facing the great glass conservatory with its domed walls reflecting the heavy, clouded sky above. I held the faded postcard in my hand, fingers tight around its edges. Beside me, Ethan gripped the sketch of the red-roofed house. The corners were frayed, the paper soft with age. Neither of us spoke. We just waited in silence, together. Then a sound soft, distinct, came from the door of the conservatory. We turned in unison. A man stepped out, long brown coat, an old cap pulled low. His gait was careful, slow but steady. He paused when he saw us, and for a moment, it seemed he couldn't move, like one wrong step would shatter the fragile moment between past and present. Then he came forward. When he stood before me, I smelled damp earth and something older, something like time itself, and sorrow. A sorrow that clung to him like scent clings to old books. He removed his cap. His hair was gray and thinning, deep lines etched across his forehead. But his eyes, I knew those eyes. I saw myself in them. I saw Ethan. Grace, he said my name like a prayer, voice low and hoarse, caught between hope and regret. Ethan. I didn't know when I had started crying, but the tears came. Silently, as I stared at him, searching, comparing, trying to piece together this weathered man with the blurred image I'd carried in my mind for 14 years. Is it real? I asked, barely audible. Are you really alive? Richard Donovan nodded. His eyes were glassy, red-rimmed. I never died, but I've been living like a ghost ever since. Ethan tightened his grip on my hand and spoke next. His voice was steady, but the tension in it was unmistakable. Then why? Why let us believe you were dead? Why let Mom live out her life in hopeless waiting, and leave us to grow up with fear, and without answers? Our father didn't speak at once. He looked down, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. When he did speak, his voice cracked. If I had come back, we all would have died. I was involved in something dangerous, something that would have made you and your mother targets. I thought disappearing was the only way to keep you safe. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. I was wrong in every way that mattered. I reached into my coat and handed him the postcard. My hands trembled. And these, are they real? You sent them? He looked at the postcard, then at the drawing in Ethan's lap, and nodded slowly. I asked a friend to deliver them, a former intelligence contact. But he vanished. I had no idea nothing ever reached you. My heart clenched. For so many years, I'd clung to anger, to grief, to the quiet certainty that my father had chosen to abandon us. And now the pieces of that narrative began to shift. The pain didn't vanish, but it started to take shape. Mom died in the hospital, I said softly. She never got to say goodbye, but she waited. Every day, tears slipped down his face, unchecked. I know, he whispered, and I know I can never ask for forgiveness. But I told myself, if I survived long enough, I would look my children in the eyes and say I'm sorry with everything I have left. Why now? Ethan asked. You've been hiding all these years. Why come out now? He raised his head. And this time, his eyes were steady. Because they've found me. And when they find me, they'll come for you. I can't let that happen. I won't let any of you be hurt because of what I did. I looked at him, still unsure what I felt. No apology could restore what had been lost. No explanation could erase the hollow years. But this man standing in front of us, with sorrow in his voice and guilt on his shoulders, was still my father. No matter how far he had fallen, and half of who I was came from him. I want the truth, I said. My voice was calm but firm. All of it. No more half-stories, no more excuses. Just the truth. He nodded, then gestured to the bench beside us. Then sit down, he said. Because the truth isn't short, and it will change everything. So we did. For the first time in 14 years, the three of us sat together again, in a quiet garden, beneath a gray sky, surrounded by the scent of dying leaves and forgotten dreams. We were no longer strangers. We were three people ready to unearth what had been buried too long beneath silence and time. And whatever came next, understanding, pain, or forgiveness, we knew it had to begin here, with the truth. That part of the story deserves to be heard by a third person. The voice came from behind us, low, calm, and so unexpected it seemed to freeze the air in the conservatory. I turned. Nick Romano. He appeared without sound, as he always did, like a shadow stepping out of the folds of memory. His presence brought my father to a halt. Richard Donovan stiffened, his gaze narrowing with the kind of recognition reserved for threats thought long buried. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening for an echo from another lifetime. Romano, he said quietly, voice sinking into a register that bordered on wary. Nick stepped forward, slow and deliberate, stopping just short of intrusion. Not close enough to threaten, but close enough that his presence began to bleed into the space between the three of us. "It's been a long time, Donovan," Nick replied. "Although, truthfully, I've been watching you for nearly 2 years." My father rose, his hand curling into a fist at his side. Ethan remained still beside me, wide-eyed, and I couldn't tear my gaze away from the confrontation unfolding. "So it's you," my father said. "The one stirring up old ghosts. The rumors about someone digging into Calloway. That was you." Nick didn't deny it. "I don't care for games, Richard. You know that. I don't sit still when there are answers to be found. Especially not when the death of my brother remains unexplained." The weight of that name, Antonio, fell like cold iron onto the stone floor. Ethan frowned, and I suddenly understood. Antonio, the brother Nick had spoken of. The one whose death was whispered about behind closed doors. Labeled a tragic accident, yet always shadowed by doubt and silence. "Antonio chose his path," Richard said slowly. "He knew exactly what he was getting into. And he didn't die because of me." "Not because of you," Nick repeated. His tone was quiet, but every syllable was carved like stone. "Then who? Because of the data he carried? Because he walked into a trap you helped lay?" "I didn't lead anyone anywhere," my father snapped. "Antonio copied the Calloway files without warning anyone. His impatience cost him his life. I tried to stop him. He wouldn't listen." Nick took one step closer. "And I'm supposed to believe that?" Richard didn't move. "You can believe what you want. But I lost everything that night too. I disappeared. I gave up my children, my name, my entire life, just to avoid ending up like your brother." "My brother wasn't reckless," Nick said, and his voice was sharp now, his pain unmasked. "He didn't walk into death unless someone promised him safety." "What did you promise him, Donovan? What made him trust you enough to die?" That was when I stood. My body placed itself between the two of them before my mind could protest. The tension felt like barbed wire coiled through the air. "Stop it," I said, my voice shaking but steady. "I didn't come here for this. I came to hear the truth from my father, not to watch you two tear each other apart over a blood-soaked past." Nick turned to me. His eyes still burned, but he halted. "You need to know that your father wasn't the only victim," he said. "And I know you didn't come here just for justice," I replied. "You came because of Antonio, because of your own loss, and I don't blame you for that, but I won't let you turn this into a trial." Richard sat again, his expression heavy with wear. "I'm not running from responsibility, but I did what I had to. If I hadn't, I'd be dead, and you and Ethan might not be here now." Nick stared at him for a long moment, then stepped back. Just one step, but it felt like the tide pulling back from the edge of a storm. "I'm not a man who forgives easily," he said, "but I won't trap her between what you and I failed to finish." He looked back at me. "You have a right to choose what to believe. Just don't take anyone's version of the truth at face value, not even your father's." Then he turned, his coat catching the wind as he walked away through the rows of trees, his shadow long and quiet behind him, like the fading trail of a fire that still smoldered somewhere deep beneath the surface. I turned back to my father. He was seated again, shoulders bowed, his face a map of fatigue and memory. "Thank you," he murmured, "for not walking away." But I didn't answer. Because I knew this wasn't over. Because no matter how many pieces we had gathered, we were still only beginning to uncover the layers. And the truth, like an old wound, was still open, still raw, still waiting to be understood. I sat beside my father in the windless conservatory. The silence around us thick with everything left unsaid and the ghosts just unearthed. A pale light filtered through the glass ceiling above, casting soft lines across his face, drawing every wrinkle into sharp relief like roads winding back through a past he'd spent 14 years trying to outrun. Ethan had quietly slipped away after the confrontation with Nick ended. He needed time. I didn't have the luxury to wait any longer. I looked at my father for a long while, then took a deep breath, forcing myself to steady the anger that had grown roots in me for too many years. I turned it into something I could say out loud. "I don't want you to keep running. Not just from the past, but from your own family." Richard looked up. His eyes were rimmed red, but his gaze was steady. "I had no choice, Grace. You don't understand. The people I crossed. If I resurfaced, everything would fall apart." "Everything already did," I said, my voice barely more than a breath. "This family shattered the day you disappeared. We grew up with questions no one could answer, with fear no one would explain. I had to become an adult when I was still just a child, And Ethan, he's lived with the guilt that his illness was what killed Mom from the inside out. He closed his eyes as if my words caused him physical pain. I kept going, because I knew if I stopped now, I'd never say it all. I don't forgive easily, but I won't carry on your silence. None of us have the time to keep running, and I think Nick Romano knows that too. He opened his eyes again, looking at me with something between gratitude and sorrow. You don't know Romano the way I do. Nick isn't the kind to let go. He was just a boy when he watched his brother die right in front of him. For him, justice isn't enough. It has to be balanced. It has to cost something. Then let me be the one to pay for your silence, I said, my voice breaking. Let me stand between two men who buried half their lives in the past, just to give this moment a chance to mean something. I'll speak to Nick, but I need you to promise me one thing. He nodded, though he didn't yet know what I was about to ask. Don't disappear again. No matter what happens after today, stay. Face it. Explain it. And if there's a debt to repay, do it as a father, not as a shadow. He didn't speak, but I watched his shoulders lower, not from the burden of hiding, but from the strange, tentative relief that comes when someone stops expecting to be forgiven and starts simply wanting to be seen. I stood, pulled out my phone, and typed Nick's number. He didn't answer, so I sent a message. Asterisk, meet me. One more time. I have something to say. Not about the past. About the future. Asterisk. An hour later, Nick arrived. No guards, no walls, just a man with a wound no one could see, doing everything he could not to let it bleed into his voice. I met him in the small lounge at the back of the conservatory. I told him everything my father had shared. I didn't soften it, didn't defend it. I said it all as calmly as I could, because some truths can't survive if you try to protect them with emotion. Nick listened in silence. His eyes stayed on me the whole time, still bright, but tired in a way I hadn't noticed before, as if he'd walked too far down the road of vengeance and realized he no longer remembered why he started. Finally I said, if there's anyone who deserves punishment, it's him. But if there's anyone who needs forgiveness so Ethan and I can live a life beyond this, it's also him. So if you must punish someone, do it. But don't make two children carry what grown men couldn't fix. Nick looked at me for a long time. Then, slowly, he nodded. I won't promise to forgive, he said, but I'll stop here. For you, not for him. I didn't need more than that, because sometimes, stopping is enough. A pause can be the start of something else entirely. And I knew, in that moment, between the three of us for the first time in years, a door had opened. Not to an ending, but to a beginning. To a chance. The following morning, the sky over Chicago was still, the pale sunlight spilling gently through the glass windows of the apartment where Ethan and I were temporarily staying. The sense of being watched was gone. There were no more hushed door creaks in the middle of the night, no more glances cast over the shoulder, and none of the suspicion I once reserved for Nick Romano. All that remained was silence, like the surface of water after a storm, and deep inside me was a quiet certainty that something was about to change today. At 10 o'clock sharp, Nick arrived, carrying a small black leather bag and a calmness that felt unfamiliar on him. He didn't speak much. He simply looked at me and nodded once, as if no explanation between us was needed. In the small living room, where Ethan was doodling absent-mindedly in a notebook, my father was already seated, waiting. Richard stood when Nick entered, the two men who had once faced each other like opposing forces now meeting again in a silence thick as unburned smoke. No one needed to revisit what had happened days before. Everyone in the room understood that today was about resolution. Nick sat in the chair across from Richard, set the leather bag on the table, and opened it. Inside was a sealed envelope and a neatly bound file. "There's no need for pleasantries," Nick said, his voice low and measured, still bearing the weight of a man who'd spent too long navigating circles of influence. "I've dug deep enough to know you still hold the original Callaway data. If I'm right, it's the only hard copy left in existence. No one else has it." Richard didn't deny it. He didn't flinch. He sat still, fingers laced together, then nodded slowly. "I've kept it. Locked away somewhere that, if I die, it'll be automatically sent to 3 separate places, including the press." Nick frowned, though he didn't seem surprised. "I figured as much. That's why I'm not here to take it. I'm here to make a deal." He pushed the envelope across the table. "In here are legal documents prepared by my team. If you agree to hand over the drive, I will pull all surveillance, end the private investigation, and you'll be left alone. You'll be granted a new identity, with discreet protection through the network I can still command. But there's a condition." Richard opened the envelope and skimmed the pages, His hands trembled slightly. It wasn't fear, it was something deeper. "What's the condition?" he asked. Nick met his eyes and didn't blink. "You don't leave the country, you don't leave your 2 children. You live, but you don't run anymore. If you want to make things right, you stay. Be a father, not a shadow." Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly. "You believe I'm capable of that?" "No," Nick said, his voice unflinching. "But I believe Grace believes you are." My eyes met my father's, and in that moment, I saw the fatigue of a lifetime etched across his face. But I also saw something else, something flickering, fragile, barely there, a light that hadn't gone out just yet. "If I give you the drive, you won't pursue me anymore? No one on your team will come after me?" "I give you my word," Nick said. "But if I find out you lied, or you try to use that data as leverage again, you know what the consequences will be." Richard didn't respond right away. He looked at me. "What do you think?" I nodded. "I can't forgive you in my mother's place, but I can give you one last chance to live up to what you once lost." Ethan stopped drawing and came to stand beside me. He didn't say a word, just took my hand and gave it a quiet squeeze. Richard closed his eyes for a few seconds. When he opened them, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small key, then unfolded a slip of paper with a handwritten address. "The drive is in a safe deposit box at an old bank in Evanston. This is the key and the address. The passcode is Grace's birthday." Nick took them without a word. He nodded once, stood, and before walking out the door, turned to Richard, his voice no longer sharp with threat, but something quieter, like fatigue. "Don't make me regret stopping." Then he left. In the room, there were only the 3 of us. 3 quiet breaths. And one agreement made not through weapons or lies, but through the last shared hope that something broken might still be rebuilt. And I understood then, for all of us, that this day marked the beginning of something we had never dared to dream of before. Peace. After that fateful meeting, things didn't change overnight like they do in movies, but something did begin to shift, unmistakably. Silence gave way to action. Nick kept his word. Less than 2 days after receiving the hard drive from Richard, he arranged for my father to be relocated to a safe apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood on the western outskirts of the city. The place had private security and wasn't connected to any conventional surveillance networks. The apartment was small, but warm, just enough space for one person to begin again, slowly. My father's schedule was clearly defined, with limited communication privileges and discreet monitoring. He was allowed to call Ethan and me 3 times a week, during fixed hours. Everything was under control, not to imprison him, but to protect him, exactly as the agreement had outlined. He accepted it without complaint, as if that modest degree of freedom was the greatest gift he'd received after so many years on the run. For Ethan, change came more slowly, but steadily. Nick fully funded his intensive treatment at a respected rehabilitation center. A psychologist was brought in to work with him regularly, and a team of physical therapists built a recovery plan week by week. Ethan began learning how to walk again, first with a support frame, then gradually managing a few steps without assistance. Every step was a victory, a living reminder that with belief and persistence, nothing is impossible. I remember the first time he walked from the living room to the balcony on his own. When he turned back, his face was dripping with sweat, but his eyes shone. "I did it," he said, beaming. "You saw that, right?" I nodded, tears falling without warning, not out of pity, but out of hope, of something that felt like rebirth. I, too, returned to work not at Club Nocturne, but at a small cafe near the city center, where the lights were never too bright and the music never louder than a whisper. I needed the job not just for the money, but because it reminded me that I could still live a normal life, after everything. In the evenings, I often stopped by my father's new apartment, bringing toasted bread or an old book. We didn't talk much, but somehow my presence seemed to help him breathe easier. One evening, he handed me a worn journal filled with fragments, memories of Ethan and me, written during the years he spent in hiding. I didn't read it right away. I just held it to my chest, the way a child might hold on to an unfinished piece of memory. Nick kept his distance, but he wrote to me regularly. Short emails, sometimes just a few lines, asking how Ethan was doing, if I needed anything, or occasionally something like, *, "It snowed last night, don't forget your coat, *. Strangely, those messages didn't feel intrusive. They felt like the cautious concern of someone who had lived too long in the dark, trying to learn how to stand in the light step by step. Sometimes I didn't reply, but I read every word, and somehow, I knew he knew that I did. Nothing was perfect. We were still learning how to forgive, learning how to live with wounds that hadn't quite healed. But more importantly, We were learning to believe that the past no longer held the right to decide everything. And in the small home where Ethan was learning to walk again, where I brewed morning coffee for my father and sat reading letters Nick had written, I began to feel something that, for so many years, had existed only as a distant concept: peace. Not an ending, exactly, but a beginning worth having. My relationship with Nick Romano didn't begin with passionate confessions or hesitant touches in the dark, but with short, restrained emails, sometimes just a simple question about the weather, a reminder to eat breakfast, or a quiet, good night sent just before midnight. Once, he wrote, "I heard it's going to snow next week. If you like hot coffee, Margot's on 53rd makes a decent cup." I didn't reply. But the next morning, I found myself at Margot's, a cappuccino in hand, unsure whether to feel sad or warm. That's how everything between us began. No rush, no clear path, no promises, but undeniable, nonetheless. We saw each other for the first time after the agreement at a small park near Ethan's treatment center. Nick arrived on time, wearing a plain black coat and carrying 2 cups of herbal tea instead of coffee. He handed me one without asking, then sat beside me at a distance far enough not to feel too close, but close enough for me to feel his presence. "How's Ethan doing?" he asked first. I told him Ethan had walked from the hallway to the kitchen without the support frame, that the doctors were beginning to allow him light training outdoors. Nick couldn't hide his relief. He nodded, then took a quiet sip of tea. The conversation that day wasn't long, but when I stood to leave, he said something I'd never forget. "I never thought I'd get the chance to talk to someone without it being a command or a threat. Thank you for that." I didn't reply. I just looked at him and nodded, then walked away feeling something inside me ache and soften, all at once. After that meeting, we continued to stay in touch through email, once a week, then twice. Gradually, I began sharing the small things, what book I was reading, a piece of music I stumbled across, or the helpless feeling of watching my father fumble through learning how to cook breakfast again after nearly 2 decades of living in hiding. Nick began to share, too. He told me about his brother, about how, as boys, they used to race through the alleys of Brooklyn, about the scent of wood shavings in their father's old forge, and how Antonio once said that life didn't need to be dazzling, it just needed someone to share the silence with. I don't know when exactly those letters became something I couldn't go a week without. We met again a few more times, never on a set schedule, never with much planning. Sometimes it was at an old Italian diner tucked inside Little Italy, the kind that still served a spicy lasagna he said used to be his brother's favorite. Other times, we just walked along the lake on cold afternoons, barely speaking. He was quieter than usual. I said very little, but in those silences, I didn't feel emptiness. I felt safe. I won't pretend I didn't sometimes wonder what was forming between us, but like him, I didn't rush to name it, because we both knew we were people who carried wounds that had scarred over, but never fully healed. There was a moment, once, when I asked why he'd never taken my hand, though he'd had more than one chance. Nick was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because when someone has lost too much, they learn to treasure the distance that keeps others from being hurt." That answer didn't make me sad. It made me understand that the respect he had for me ran deeper than any gesture meant to charm. I don't know what the future will bring. But for now, I know this. There's someone once a name whispered only in shadows, who now sends me words filled with light. And in a world full of impermanence, perhaps that is already a beginning more precious than anything I've ever known. 6 months later, we moved into a small lakeside villa near Lake Geneva, about a 2-hour drive from the city. The house was a pale cream 2-story cottage, surrounded by lavender bushes and climbing roses, tucked quietly beneath a canopy of old maple trees, as if it had been waiting for us all along. No one said it out loud, but we all understood. This was a new beginning. Not to forget the past, but to learn how to live with it without being held hostage by it. Ethan had recovered beyond what any doctor had predicted. He could walk the garden paths each morning, sometimes helping me water the flowers or pushing a cart back from the nearby farmer's market. His face was brighter, his voice steadier, and most importantly, his eyes no longer flinched at the mention of our father. He and Richard still kept their distance, but now it was the kind of space between two people learning how to know each other again, not a wall between strangers. One afternoon, I saw them sitting together on the porch, one reading a book, the other simply listening to the wind in the willows. They didn't speak, but their presence next to each other felt like its own quiet language, gentle and heavier than words. Richard lived upstairs, in a room with a wide window facing the lake. He spent most of his time writing down everything he had been through, not to justify, but to record a path he'd once been forced to walk in silence. Once, He handed me a page, unfinished, and asked what I thought of a particular memory. I read it, nodded, and handed it back without a word. He didn't press. But the next morning, I found a sealed envelope left beside the breakfast table. 3 handwritten words on the front. "Thank you, Grace." I never opened it. I just kept it. As proof that between us, even with all that was still unsaid, trust had begun to return to the right place. Each morning, I woke to birdsong in the garden, brewed 2 cups of tea, and opened the kitchen doors to let in the light. Sometimes Ethan would come first, carrying a new book. Sometimes it was my father, bringing a piece of freshly baked bread. And me, I felt lighter with each passing day, as if life had finally decided to let me go. Nick never said he would come, but I knew he would. In the past 6 months, even from afar, he never broke the habit of writing. No longer the short, careful lines they used to be. Now, his letters were longer, stories about a closed-door negotiation, a little wine bar he'd found in Italy, or an old tune that played on a quiet street reminding him of a dance from another time. I read them all, saved every one, as if keeping a part of him close. That afternoon, just as the lavender bloomed with its first blush of purple, I was tending to the flower pots on the porch when I heard the soft sound of a car stopping by the gate. Ethan looked at me through the window, said nothing, just smiled. I walked out slowly, as if afraid that moving too fast would make the moment disappear. Nick was standing there, beside his familiar car, no overcoat, no bodyguards. He simply looked at me, his gaze calm and steady like a lake after the rain. I didn't ask why he had come. No greetings were needed. I just walked up to him, and for the first time after everything, he reached out his hand, brushing lightly against mine. No words, no promises. In that moment, I knew everything had changed. No more secrets, no more chases, no more fear lurking in the corners of our lives. There was only a home by the lake, 3 people who were once a broken family now learning to breathe together again. And a man, once known as the most dangerous name in the city, now standing quietly beside me as if he had been waiting all his life for this one quiet chance to begin again. That afternoon, the sun poured golden light onto the lake, reflections dancing across the water like scattered gold leaf. In the small garden outside the porch, lavender and asters swayed gently in the breeze, their soft scent floating through the air like an invitation to peace. I was setting the table for tea when I heard familiar footsteps behind me. When I turned, Nick was already there wearing a plain white shirt, his face carrying a stillness I never thought he could wear. He didn't say a word, just walked toward me slowly, as if each step was his way of confirming that this place, this moment, was real. I moved toward him too. No explanations, no walls left to climb. And in that instant, he wrapped his arms around me for the first time since all of this began. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't hesitant. It was the embrace of a man who had lost too much, now holding what he cherished with all the quiet care of someone who finally understood its weight. He whispered near my ear, his voice low, familiar, and soft. I used to wonder if I'd ever get to remember that first dance. But now I believe this is just the beginning. I looked up. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw the opening lines of a new chapter, no longer haunted by darkness, no longer shackled by regret, but full of days gentle enough to love, to trust, and to finally be real. Life will always bring storms. Asterisk, asterisk. It will carry us far from what we knew, from what we believed. But it is in moments like these, quiet, unremarkable to the world, when 2 people once torn apart choose forgiveness and walk forward side by side, that we truly understand. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is the path to healing. Trust is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to keep going, even when we know we might get hurt. And love? Love is seeing someone clearly with all their scars, and still choosing to stay. Thank you for staying with this story until its final moment. If this journey moved something in you, please click subscribe and share this video with someone you care about. At Dear Single Mom, we hope to continue bringing you stories that stir the heart, that help you see yourself in every character, in every quiet breath between the lines. What did you think of Grace, Nick, and their family's journey? Have you ever witnessed or lived something like this yourself? Leave a comment below. Your voice might be the light someone else is waiting for. Once again, thank you. Wishing you strength, peace, and joy every single day. Until next time, with love from all of us at Dear Single Mom.